school teacher. John Grisham is probably one of today's most prolific authors. He's written over 35 novels, other novellas, short stories. I think my wife has on our bookcase in our living room, has every one of those novels and has read all of them, I think. Now, in all that, there's one book of nonfiction. It's called The Innocent Man. It's about this guy in Ada, Oklahoma, Ron Williamson, who was convicted in 1982 of the murder of a 21-year-old woman, and he spent 11 years on death row. Well, after those 11 years, he was exonerated because of DNA evidence. And in 2018, that book became a Netflix series. Well, that is just one of the countless stories of innocent people paying for crimes that they didn't commit. And sometimes that's due to prejudice. Sometimes that's due to a rush of judgment. Other times it's just circumstantial evidence that points in their direction, even though they didn't do the crime. Well, either way, these people, including Ron, they were a victim of injustice. And to say that going through that is tough is an understatement. Now, injustice, of course, we know this. It's an age-old issue. There are so many examples in the Bible. We have Cain killing his brother Abel. Nothing just about that. We have Job, a righteous man, a holy man, suffered great loss of his family and belongings and all that. And then Solomon, in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 15, he said this, "In this meaningless life of mine, I have seen both of these things, the righteous perishing in their righteousness, and the wicked living long in their wickedness." And then, of course, we are in the story of Joseph. So that's where we are today, looking at his injustice. So we're going to be in chapter 39 and 40 of Genesis, if you want to go ahead and be finding that. So as a reminder, we're in the third lesson of this unit called How to Avoid Life's Pitfalls. And we're looking at the pitfall of injustice this week out of, like I said, Genesis 39 and 40. And the point of this lesson is this: press forward in spite of injustice. Well, we'll see in this lesson as we continue in the study of Joseph that his life offers proof that even when you or I are the subject or the object of injustice, that God is always aware of your circumstances. And like Joseph, we can choose positive action even when we're in those awful situations. So last week we saw that Joseph avoided the pitfall of temptation, but this integrity, it cost him his job. Because when Joseph fled the scene, his cloak was left behind, and Potiphar's wife screamed and claimed that Joseph tried to attack her. So what happened? The husband, Potiphar, he was very angry, of course, not knowing what his wife was doing all along. And so he threw Joseph into prison. So in return for his purity and righteousness and integrity in refusing the advances of his master's wife, Joseph wound up in prison. And that's not justice at all, is it? Just like the guy in Ada, Oklahoma. Well, even there in prison, God blessed him and gave him favor in the warden's eyes. We all find ourselves from time to time in some less than ideal circumstances, don't we? You know, we can have a rainy day at the beach, but sometimes those circumstances have far greater impacts on our lives. Someone who's never smoked, they get lung cancer. There's a baby in the neighborhood or in your city who's killed by random gunshot fire. Someone lies at work and you get fired. You know? And when those things happen, we can feel that our life is practically over. But here in the book of Genesis, we are shown that Joseph, a man whose circumstances were far from ideal, because he'd been forgotten, he'd been left in prison. He was a victim of injustice. But in all that, he was not defeated by his circumstances. So as we look at Genesis chapter 39, verses 21 through 23, it says this: "The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." Well, see, if you remember now, Joseph was in prison because he was falsely accused of something he didn't do. Now, we've all had that happen, not the prison part necessarily, but we've all been falsely accused of something, haven't we? And we know how that makes us feel. But Joseph didn't let that get to him. He continued being the godly man that he was. So Joseph continued to do what God had gifted him to do. Joseph was equipped to dream and to interpret dreams and to lead. And so Joseph exercised those gifts even when he was in the depths of an Egyptian prison. Now, as believers, we need to be aware of whose we are and what God has gifted us to do. So those are important things to remember. So when we are forgotten, or we are down, or we are victims of injustice, we need to remember these things about how important we actually are to God. So verses like Psalm 139:13 that says, "For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb." Okay, we're not an accident. It's like Rick Warren said, there are no illegitimate children, only illegitimate parents. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 12 through 31, the Apostle Paul compares Christians in the church like parts in the body, that everybody has a purpose and a function. So we, like Joseph, we have to take our individual gifting and abilities and responsibilities seriously, even when we're victims of injustice. So even when we face difficulty, we have to continue to use those gifts that God has given us. And we keep on doing what we know we should be doing. Now look at Joseph's situation. He went from being the favored son of Jacob to a slave in Potiphar's house. And he kind of worked his way up there. He served with integrity and excellence. And now he's gone down even further. He's now a slave. He went from a slave to being a prisoner in a land that he's not even a citizen of. His position went from bad to worst. And we don't know what Joseph did to distinguish himself here in prison, but his character reflected his integrity and his trustworthiness. And consequently, he was given the responsibility and authority there in that prison. And so he's kind of like what we would call a trustee in the prison system today. So instead of wallowing in self-pity, he continued to serve. Now, we all know of people who have done the exact opposite of Joseph's example. They are always the victim. And you know, it's not attractive, is it? It's the poor me. This happened to me. Why did that have to happen? You know, all that. And it makes me want to tell that person to put a rubber band around their head and snap out of it. But of course, that's not a very nice thing to say, is it? Well, when things are going well, you know, it's easy to say, well, God's good all the time. But when bad things happen, we often wonder, where was God? Why didn't he protect me? Why does this happen? See, we can't always understand God's purposes in the short term, or sometimes even in the long term. We don't know what God's doing in the background. Now, with smartphones, as they've become pretty much a staple in today's society, you know, one of the things we can do is the pinching of a photo to get a wide shot. And then we can also do that to where we can see more and more detail. And while we're focused on the here and now, we don't, when we pinch that photo and we get a bigger picture, that's kind of what God's seeing. God is seeing that bigger picture of things and not just the little pixel that we are in right now. Now, here's the thing. Even though we know better, we can still subconsciously have this philosophy that when times are good, God is blessing. When bad things are happening, God is punishing us. It's kind of like in the New Testament, the man that was born blind, and the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this guy or his parents, that he was born blind? And what was Jesus' answer? You remember that? It was, well, neither. It was so that the work of God could be displayed. And so when those bad things are in our life, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe even when we're a victim of injustice, maybe God's power and his work is going to be displayed somehow in the midst of that. Well, how do we remain faithful when we find ourselves where we didn't expect to be? When we find ourselves being fired for something we didn't do, or some other kind of form of injustice? Well, we continue doing what we know what's right. We continue using whatever talents and gifts as we can to serve God and to point other people to God. See, God was with Joseph, even in prison. We are told that he prospered in everything he did. And through all of these trials, Joseph remained faithful to God. A person of less faith than Joseph's may have complained about their situation, complained to God. Now, another question is, in what ways does this story parallel Joseph's rise to success in Potiphar's house. We see a similarity here that we see in both cases the Lord was with him. He started off kind of low and worked his way up. God granted him kindness and favor of the eyes of the prison warden as well as Potiphar. Joseph was put in charge of his immediate sphere of influence in both situations. And in both cases, both Potiphar and the warden, they weren't concerned with anything. You know, it's like, you've got control of it. I'm not even concerned about it. That's how much faith they had in Joseph. Well, the point here, remember the point of the lesson, press forward in spite of injustice. So remember that, got to press forward. Don't wallow around. Don't do the pity party thing. Keep pressing forward. Now, let's read chapter 40, verses 5 and 8. It says, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but no one's here to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. Well, one day a couple of new prisoners were added to the prison population, Pharaoh's cupbearer and the chief baker. Now, we don't know what their specific crimes were, but they obviously had offended Pharaoh and had made him angry enough to toss them into prison. Now, these two men, the cupbearer and the baker, they were more than just men in charge of wine in the bakery. They were also advisors to Pharaoh. In verse 7, it refers to them as Pharaoh's officers. They may have been prisoners at that moment, but it became Joseph's duty to wait on them, to minister to them. And Joseph did more than just his duty to serve these men. He showed genuine concern for them when they were obviously distraught. And so, noticing their sadness, Joseph asked, how could he help? Such compassion surely was beyond his job description as trustee of the prison. That same night, both men had these troubling dreams that they couldn't understand, no one could interpret. And Joseph agreed to help them and told them the ability to interpret these dreams came from God alone. So he was giving God the credit for this. He wasn't taking credit for it. Now, no doubt God gave him great insight, and Joseph's skill in interpreting dreams was another indication that God was still with him and using him, even in prison. And Joseph pointed to God, and it certainly appeared that God was working in his life through interpreting these dreams. Here's a question you might want to ask your class. Does God continue to speak to people through dreams? We hear about dreams of people in Muslim countries having this visual picture of this godlike being or something. And when somebody, one of our missionaries there undercover, talks to them about Jesus, it clicks with them. That's who I was dreaming about. Well, Joseph, he was age 17 when he was in Egypt, or when he was sold into slavery and went to Egypt, and he was 30 when he was delivered from prison. So he spent 13 years as both a servant in Potiphar's house and then a prisoner here in the prison in Egypt. And Joseph eventually became the second in command in Egypt. We're going to be seeing that later. But he first experienced those 13 years of discipline, of training, of preparation. His path to a position of great authority and leadership was a path of humble service to others. It was a path that wasn't a straight up, it was a roller coaster, wasn't it? In verses 9 through 19, we see that Joseph interpreted those dreams. And for the cupbearer, he said, here's the interpretation of your dreams. In 3 days, you're going to be restored to your position. But to the baker, he said, in 3 days, you're going to be executed and impaled, and birds are going to eat your flesh. Ooh, okay, let's look on down to verse 20 through 23 of chapter 40. It says this, now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a full feast for all of his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and of the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. See, Joseph showed compassion in helping the baker and the cupbearer, and he faithfully shared what God had revealed to him regarding their dreams. And Joseph, though, he made only one request in return. when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness. Show me some kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. And what came of that request? Verse 23, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Not only was he forgotten, but Joseph was forgotten by someone he had helped. Thankfully, God never forgets us. Unlike the imperfect humans that we are and that surround us, he never makes mistakes. Therefore, we can remain confident in his plan, even when it seems like we've been left out of that plan. We may feel that God's absent, but we know that he is still there, always loving us, watching over us. Joseph felt forgotten, I'm sure, but he didn't quit. Tragedy is not terminal. Disappointment is not the final chapter. Pain is not the ultimate end for the child of God. God gets the final word, always. God gets the final word, always. When we allow this truth to be hidden in our hearts, quitting isn't an option. Even when we feel that we're a victim of injustice or we've been forgotten by the world. Well, after prophesying the cupbearer's reliefs, Joseph must have felt disappointed when he was forgotten. The cupbearer let Joseph down. But here again, Joseph refused to give in to despair. He didn't poison his life by complaining and assigning blame. He didn't give up and grow bitter. Instead, he continued to live that life of faithfulness to God, trusting God to fulfill God's plans, his plans. As we said earlier, most, if not all of us, had had similar experiences. Not in prison necessarily, but we've been betrayed. We've been forgotten. A family member has disillusioned us. A trusted friend's let us down. And when disappointment with people stirs agony in our hearts, we can patiently trust in the Lord as we apply ourselves to the best of our abilities. Hopeless situations happen, but they don't need to produce hopelessness. Hopeless situations do not need to produce hopelessness. Joseph didn't see the situation resolved in this passage that we have today. Resolution wouldn't come for another 2 more years, but the man we see come out on the other side in our next session is the same faithful Joseph that we saw going into this. Just remember, God loves you. God loves you as his unique child, but that does not mean that you're somehow going to avoid being a victim of injustice or being forgotten. The good news is that you can choose to make a positive impact during those moments, just as Joseph did. And like Joseph, we can keep our focus and do what we know we need to keep on doing, caring for other people. Well, next week we're going to be looking at the pitfall of hard times. Okay? Seems like that's all Joseph's life is hard times. So we're going to be continuing in his life, studying his life. Don't forget to pray for and with your class this week. Thank you guys for watching.